She thought a new life was waiting for her. But in the Montana territory, a new life often meant a new kind of death. The train shrieked as it tore into the station, a metal beast breathing steam and soot. It was September 1883. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and horses. People swarmed the wooden platform, a chaotic dance of luggage, children, and cowboys whose eyes were narrowed slits of judgment. Out of this chaos stepped Clara. She wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days, and clutched a small, scuffed suitcase to her chest as if it were a shield. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and terror. For weeks on that rattling train she had dreamed of this exact moment. She pictured a man with kind eyes, a man who would welcome her with a gentle smile and offer her the fresh start she so desperately craved. The man from the letters. But as her worn boots hit the rough planks of the platform, a cold dread washed over her. The stares of strangers felt like tiny needles on her skin. Was she truly wanted here? Or had she just traveled 1,000 miles to step into the cruelest trap of her life? Clara tightened her grip on the suitcase, her knuckles white. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces, searching for the one she only knew from a faded photograph. And then she saw him. He stood near the station master's office, taller than she'd imagined. He was the man who had written those beautiful letters, the ones filled with promises of a shared future, a home, a life. He was supposed to be her salvation. His eyes found hers across the crowd. For a single, breathless second, the world stood still. But the moment his gaze truly landed on her, something inside her shattered. There was no warmth in his eyes, no welcoming smile. Instead, a flicker of sharp, undisguised disappointment crossed his face. His mouth, which she had imagined speaking words of love, twisted into a sneer of pure disgust. Before she could take a single hopeful step toward him, he raised his voice. It was loud, loud enough for the merchants to hear, loud enough for the cowboys to hear, loud enough for every man, woman, and child on that platform to turn and stare right at her. "You're too fat," he said, the words cutting through the station noise like a whip crack. And in that single brutal instant, the world fell out from under her. A hot, searing shame burned its way up her neck and flooded her cheeks. Whispers erupted around her, spreading through the crowd like a contagion. Merchants paused their haggling to turn their heads. Cowboys smirked into their hands. Women pulled their children closer, as if Clara's very presence was a curse. Her dream, so carefully stitched together over 1,000 miles of lonely travel, was torn to shreds in front of a jury of strangers who would forget her name by morning. But she would remember this moment. She would remember the look on every single face for the rest of her days. She tried to hold herself steady, but her knees buckled under the crushing weight of his rejection. She wanted to scream at him, to ask him why. Why write the letters? Why make the promises? Why ask her to leave everything she had ever known behind, only to publicly humiliate her? But her lips were frozen shut. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. He didn't wait for her to speak. He simply turned his back on her, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than a piece of faulty cargo that had arrived on the afternoon train. With each step he took away from her, a piece of her dignity scattered across the dusty platform, lost forever. People looked at her now, not with curiosity, but with a cold, detached pity that was somehow worse than their mockery. In that vast, uncaring sea of strangers, she was completely and utterly alone, betrayed not just by the man she had trusted, but by the fragile hope that had kept her alive. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear. But her legs were rooted to the spot, heavy as stone. The voices around her became a dull roar, but she could still pick out the individual sounds that cut deeper than any knife. The soft, cruel laughter of a group of young men. The low hiss of gossip from the women in their Sunday bonnets. And worst of all, the heavy silence from those who simply turned away, as if her pain was an ugly sight they didn't wish to see. Yet in that unbearable moment of total collapse, Clara forced herself to breathe. She had crossed hundreds of miles of unforgiving plains. She had endured the long, fearful nights inside a rattling metal cage. She had carried with her the courage to believe in love when the world had given her every reason not to. And if this man, this coward who chose cruelty over a simple, quiet rejection, thought he had broken her, he was wrong. Her heart was a raw, gaping wound. But somewhere deep inside, in the place where her soul resided, a tiny flicker of something refused to be extinguished. A flicker of defiance. A flicker that whispered a dangerous thought into the silence of her mind. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was just the beginning of a story she hadn't chosen, but one she would be forced to survive. Clara lowered her head, the brim of her hat hiding her face from the world. She picked up her suitcase and walked away from the stairs, her steps unsteady but deliberate. She moved past the edge of the platform, away from the noise, to a place where the only sound was the lonely creak of wood beneath her boots. She found a rough, splintered bench at the far end of the station yard and sank onto it, pressing the suitcase to her chest like a prayer. The man's words echoed in her ears, a memory already burning itself into her soul. "You're too fat," an epitaph for a life that had never even begun. Her eyes stung, the landscape blurring into a watercolor of grief. She fought to keep the tears locked away, but the weight in her chest was too heavy. Slowly, a single tear slipped free, then another, tracing silent paths of sorrow down her face. She sat there, invisible, as the world moved on without her. Wagons rattled by on the dirt road. Children laughed, their joy a sharp and painful sound. Cowboys shouted to one another across the street, and still, she was trapped in a silence only she could hear. A silence littered with the ashes of her broken dreams. She should have never come. That's what she whispered to the empty air. Every mile was a mistake. Every letter was a lie. And now, she had no home to return to, no family waiting, no one in this entire God-forsaken world to tell her that she mattered. A gnawing hunger twisted in her stomach, but it was nothing compared to the starvation in her soul. She craved a single drop of kindness. The cold wind that swept across the plains felt like a razor against her skin, a constant reminder of how utterly alone she was in a land that didn't even know her name. Fear began to coil in her gut. She pictured the coming night, cold and starless, with no roof over her head. She imagined mornings without food, days spent wandering aimlessly with nothing to believe in. The suitcase on her lap suddenly felt impossibly heavy, not with the weight of her few belongings, but with the weight of a hope she could no longer trust. A dark voice began to whisper in her mind. You were foolish for dreaming, foolish for believing a stranger's words, foolish for thinking anyone could ever love you. She tried to push the voice away, but it grew louder with each passing moment, amplified by the memory of the laughing, whispering crowd. She wanted to scream, to let out all the pain and rage and sorrow, but no sound would come. Only the deep, hollow ache of silence. Should she leave? Try to find her way back to a life that no longer existed? Or should she just stay on this bench until the world simply swallowed her whole? Her body trembled with exhaustion and grief. She was broken, but she was still breathing. And so she waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Maybe a sign. Maybe an answer. Maybe just the final, merciful darkness. Anything to prove that her long journey had not ended in nothing but shame. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple. The shadows grew long and menacing across the station yard. Clara sat frozen, her hands clenched so tightly around the handle of her suitcase that her fingers ached. Her face was a pale, tear-stained mask of despair. That's when she heard it, the sound of steady, heavy boots approaching from behind. "Ma'am?" a voice said, deep and startlingly gentle. "Are you all right?" The question broke through the fog of her misery. She lifted her head, her movements slow and stiff, like an old woman's. A man was standing there, silhouetted against the fading light. He was broad-shouldered, his skin weathered by the sun, his hat tilted low. She tried to hide the evidence of her tears, to pull herself together, but she knew it was useless. His eyes, she could feel, missed nothing. He didn't press her. He didn't ask what had happened. He just stood there, waiting with a quiet patience that was more comforting than any words could have been. Then, he knelt down and set a small metal canteen on the bench beside her. "You look like you could use this," he said simply. Pride told her to refuse. She didn't want his pity, but her body betrayed her. Her throat was raw, her lips cracked and dry. With trembling hands, she reached for the canteen and lifted the cool water to her lips. The first sip felt like life itself pouring back into her. When she looked up at him again, she noticed something strange. His gaze hadn't once drifted to her body, to her shape. His eyes were fixed on her face, on her eyes, as if he were trying to read the story of the sorrow he saw there. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. He gave a slow nod. "Name's Samuel," he said. "I've a ranch just outside of town. Came in for supplies. Couldn't help but notice you." His words were plain, direct, but held no judgment. The simple kindness in them began to chip away at the wall of ice she had built around her heart. But fear was a stubborn thing. She couldn't stop the suspicious thoughts. Was this just another trap? Would this man offer her a moment of pity today, only to turn on her tomorrow? She searched his face for any sign of mockery, any hint of deception, but found only a steady, unwavering calm. It was as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her to trust him. "You need a place to rest for the night," he said. It wasn't a question or a demand. It was a statement of fact. "My wife passed a few years back. The house is quiet. Too quiet. You'd be safe there." Her mind screamed at her. Don't trust him. Remember the letters. Remember the promises. But her soul, battered and exhausted, ached for a single moment of safety, a single night of warmth. The memory of her public shaming begged her to run, to stay alone. But as she looked into this stranger's patient eyes, she heard herself whisper a single word, a word so quiet it was barely carried on the wind. "Yes." Samuel extended his hand. It was rough and calloused from years of hard work, but it was as steady as a rock. Hesitantly, Clara placed her small, trembling hand in his. The moment their skin touched, she realized it was the first human contact she'd had since her journey began that wasn't laced with cruelty, judgment, or disappointment. It was just a calm, quiet strength that asked for nothing in return. As he helped her to her feet and led her toward a simple buckboard wagon waiting nearby, she dared to glance back one last time at the train station. The place where her heart had been shattered just a few hours earlier. The pain was still there, a dull, heavy ache. But as she walked away with this unexpected stranger, a tiny, fragile spark of hope she thought had been extinguished forever began to glow once more in the darkness. The wagon wheels rattled over the uneven dirt road, carrying Clara away from the town and its ghosts. Uncertainty was her only companion, a cold shadow clinging to her shoulders. But somewhere in the quiet strength of the man sitting beside her, a strange feeling began to take root. A feeling that this journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the days that followed, Samuel's ranch became her unlikely sanctuary. It was a simple, rugged place, carved out of the unforgiving Montana landscape. But it was peaceful. The harsh sting of her humiliation slowly began to fade, replaced by the gentle, predictable rhythm of life under a vast, endless sky. Every morning, Samuel was up before the sun, his movements quiet and efficient. And every morning, when Clara emerged from the small guest room he had given her, she would find a plate of warm bread and a cup of coffee waiting on the kitchen table. He never said much. It was just his way of offering care without demanding thanks. As the days turned into a week, then two, he began to show her the land that had shaped him. He led her through rolling fields of tall grass where wildflowers swayed in the breeze. He pointed out the distant mountains, their peaks painted in shades of hazy blue and purple. He took her to the corral, where a dozen horses ran wild and free, their powerful bodies kicking up clouds of golden dust. The sight of them, so strong and untamed, stirred something in her that had been dormant for a long time. She found herself laughing at their restless energy, and the sound of her own joy was a shock to her ears after so many weeks of silence. She saw Samuel watching her from the fence, and his eyes softened with a quiet pride that needed no words. He seemed to value her spirit, the part of her that the world had tried so hard to crush. In the evenings, they would sit on the worn wooden porch, watching the sky blaze with the colors of the setting sun. They didn't talk about her past, about the man at the station. They talked about simple things, the changing of the seasons, the stubborn nature of horses, the lonely, haunting songs of the coyotes that echoed through the hills at night. With each conversation, she felt a little bit of the weight lift from her shoulders. He wasn't trying to erase her pain, but he was helping her see that it didn't have to define her. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to simply be, to breathe without shame, to stand tall without flinching under the imagined stares of others, to move through the world without fear. Samuel never once looked at her the way other men did. He never measured her appearance with a cold, calculating gaze. Instead, he saw the strength in her quiet resilience, the kindness in the way she cared for the chickens, the fire in her eyes when she talked about the books she used to read. She began to work alongside him, her hands, once soft and pale, growing calloused from gathering firewood and tending the small garden. And with each task, she realized something profound. She was not a burden here. She was not a mistake. She was a partner, contributing to a life that was both hard and beautiful. Every moment she spent on that ranch was slowly rewriting the cruel memory of the train station. The woman who had sat on that bench, broken and humiliated, was beginning to fade. In her place, someone new was emerging. Someone stronger. Someone whose heart, though scarred, was beginning to heal in the quiet, steady presence of a man who saw her not as too much or too little, but as enough. Exactly as she was. One afternoon, while cleaning out the small cabin that served as Samuel's workshop, her hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath an old workbench. Curiosity piqued, she pried it up. Underneath, tucked away in the dark, dusty space, was a small, leather-bound book. It wasn't a journal. It was a ledger. She opened it, her fingers tracing the neat columns of names and dates. The first few pages were records of cattle sales and supply costs, but as she flipped further, the entries changed. They were still names, all of them women's names. Beside each name was a date of arrival, and then, a few weeks or months later, another entry, a sum of money, paid out to a J.M. A chill went down her spine. There were at least a dozen names. Mary, Elizabeth, Sarah, Anne. All of them arriving in different months over the past 3 years. And after each name, the same pattern. Arrival, a short stay, and then a payout. What was this? Who were these women? And who was J.M.? Her mind raced. Was Samuel not the simple, kind rancher he appeared to be? Was this ranch not a sanctuary, but something else entirely? A holding place? Her heart began to pound in her chest, a frantic, panicked rhythm. She thought of his kindness, his quiet respect. Had it all been a lie? A carefully constructed performance to earn her trust? She remembered the way he found her at the station, so perfectly timed, as if he had been waiting. She slammed the ledger shut, her hands trembling. She had to get out. Now. She shoved the book back under the floorboard and crept out of the workshop, her mind spinning. The ranch, which had felt like a refuge only moments before, now seemed like a prison. The vast, open sky felt menacing. The silence of the landscape was no longer peaceful, but threatening. She packed her small suitcase in a frenzy, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fasten the latches. She had to leave before Samuel returned from the fields. She scribbled a hasty note, a simple, "Thank you for your kindness, but I must be on my way," leaving it on the kitchen table. It was a lie, but what else could she do? She slipped out of the house and began to walk, almost run, down the long dirt road that led back to town. The sun was hot on her back, and every gust of wind sounded like footsteps behind her. The town was miles away, a long and grueling journey on foot, but she didn't care. Anywhere was better than here. Anywhere was better than being another name in that terrible book. After what felt like hours, she saw a rider approaching in the distance. Her blood ran cold. It was Samuel. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The plains offered no cover. She could only stand there, her heart hammering against her ribs, as he rode up to her, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "Clara, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine surprise. "Where are you going?" "I'm leaving," she said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. "I can't stay." A look of deep hurt crossed his face. "Why? Did I do something? Did I frighten you?" The ledger, the names, the money. The questions swirled in her head, but she couldn't bring herself to ask them. What if she was wrong? But what if she was right? "I found the book," she blurted out, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. "Under the floorboards in the workshop. The ledger, with all the names." Samuel's face went pale. The look of concern was replaced by something else, something she couldn't quite read. Fear? Guilt? He swung himself down from his horse, his movements stiff. "Clara, you don't understand," he said, taking a step toward her. She flinched and took a step back. "Don't come near me. Who are they, Samuel? Who are all those women?" He stopped, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. He looked not at her, but at the ground, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "They were like you," he said. "Women who came to Montana for a new start. Women who were disappointed." "And you just happened to find all of them?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And what about the money? The payments to JM?" He finally met her gaze, and his eyes were filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "JM is Jedediah Monroe," he said quietly. "The man who met you at the station." Clara stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. Jedediah? The man who had rejected her? What did he have to do with this? "I don't understand," she whispered. "Jedediah. He works for someone else," Samuel explained, his voice heavy with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. "A man who runs this town, this whole county. A man named Judge Blackstone. Blackstone brings women out here, promising them marriage, a new life. But it's a lie. He traps them." "Traps them for what?" Clara asked, her throat tight. "For his saloons, for his mines, for whatever he wants," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Once they're here, they have no family, no money, no one to turn to. They disappear, and no one ever asks any questions." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture more horrific than she could have imagined. "And Jedediah? He brings them here?" "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "He's the one who writes the letters, makes the promises. He gets paid for every woman he delivers." "So the names in your book?" "Are the women I tried to save," he said, his voice thick with regret. "When I realized what was happening, I started watching the station. I'd try to get to them before Jedediah could hand them over to Blackstone's men. I'd pay Jedediah off, that's the money in the ledger, to tell Blackstone the woman never arrived, or that she ran off. Then I'd give them a safe place to stay until I could arrange passage for them to leave the territory for good. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to believe him. I saved a dozen women that way, Clara. But a few months ago, Blackstone found out. He sent his men to my ranch. They took the last woman I was sheltering, a girl named Sarah. And they warned me that if I ever interfered again, they would burn my ranch to the ground and bury me under it. He took a deep breath, the sound ragged and torn. So when I saw Jedediah meeting you at the station, I was terrified. I couldn't interfere directly, not anymore. I was hiding, watching, trying to figure out what to do. And then he did the most unexpected thing. He rejected you, so publicly, so cruelly. Clara stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. I didn't understand it at first, Samuel continued. But then I realized what he was doing. It was the only way he could think of to save you. If he publicly shamed you, made you seem undesirable, Blackstone's men wouldn't be interested. They'd see you as a mistake, a waste of time. They'd leave you alone. It was a cruel kindness, Clara. He hurt you to save you from something far, far worse. The cruelty, the public humiliation. It wasn't born of disgust. It was a desperate, twisted act of protection. The man she had hated, the man whose words had haunted her dreams, had been trying to save her life. After his men left you on that bench, Samuel said, his voice barely audible, Jedediah found me. He told me what he'd done. He begged me to look after you, to make sure you were safe. He said he couldn't live with himself if anything happened to you. The truth was so much more complex, so much more terrifying than she had ever imagined. The entire town wasn't just a place of strangers, it was a hunting ground. And she had been the prey. Jedediah's cruelty had been her shield. Samuel's kindness had been her sanctuary. But the hunter was still out there. And now, Judge Blackstone knew that Samuel had interfered once again. He had taken in the woman who was supposed to be cast aside. He had broken his promise. And he would be coming for them both. A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the air. Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the horizon. On a distant ridge, a lone rider was silhouetted against the sky. Then another, and another. "They're here," Samuel said, his voice grim. "Blackstone's men." Panic seized Clara, cold and sharp. "What do we do?" "We run," he said, grabbing the reins of his horse. He swung himself into the saddle and reached down for her. "There's no time. We have to ride." He pulled her up behind him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He spurred the horse, and they took off across the plains, away from the road, away from the approaching riders. The wind whipped at her face, tearing the breath from her lungs. She looked back and saw the riders, at least a half dozen of them, fanning out, their dark shapes growing larger and larger. This wasn't just a chase. It was a hunt. And the fragile sense of peace she had found was just a beautiful lie before the storm. The story wasn't over. The most dangerous part had just begun. They rode hard, the horse's hooves thundering against the dry, cracked earth. Samuel pushed the animal to its limit, his body tense, his eyes constantly scanning the rugged landscape for a path, for cover, for any hope of escape. Clara clung to him, her face pressed against his back, the rhythmic pounding of his heart a strange counterpoint to the terror flooding her veins. The riders were gaining. She could hear the faint sound of their shouts carried on the wind, a chilling, predatory sound. "There's a series of canyons up ahead," Samuel yelled over his shoulder. "If we can make it there, we might be able to lose them." The land grew rougher, the flat plains giving way to rocky outcrops and steep, sun-baked hills. The horse stumbled, its breath coming in ragged, heaving gasps. They were losing time. The shouts of their pursuers grew louder, closer. A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet whining past Clara's ear so close she could feel its heat. She screamed, burying her face deeper into Samuel's back. He urged the horse onward, his voice a low, soothing murmur to the terrified animal. They finally reached the mouth of the canyon, a narrow slit in the towering rock walls. They plunged into the shadows, the sudden coolness a shock to their skin. The canyon twisted and turned, a maze of stone and sand. The sounds of the pursuit grew fainter, muffled by the rock. After what felt like an eternity, Samuel pulled the horse to a halt behind a massive boulder. They both sat there, panting, listening. The only sound was the wind whistling through the narrow passages. I think we lost them," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse. He slid from the saddle, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. He reached up to help Clara down, his hands gentle on her waist. For a moment, they just stood there, leaning against each other, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede, leaving a trembling exhaustion in its wake. "Now what?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "We stay here until nightfall," Samuel said. "Then we try to make our way east, toward the territories. We can't go back. Not to the ranch, not to the town. There's no place safe for us in this county as long as Blackstone is alive." As the hours passed, the silence of the canyon was both a comfort and a torment. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. They spoke in low whispers, filling in the missing pieces of the story. Clara learned of Judge Blackstone's iron grip on the region, his network of spies and enforcers, the way he used fear and debt to control everyone and everything. He was more than a corrupt judge. He was a king in his own private, brutal kingdom. Samuel, in turn, learned of Clara's life before she came west. A life of quiet desperation, of feeling invisible, of clinging to the hope offered in a handful of letters from a stranger. "I never should have judged Jedediah so harshly," she said, her voice filled with a strange mix of guilt and wonder. "To do something so cruel, just to save a stranger. I don't know if I could have done that." "He's not a bad man," Samuel said quietly. "He's a trapped one. Blackstone has his family, his sister. He uses her to control him. Jedediah does what he's told because he has no choice. The story was no longer just about her. It was about all the nameless women in the ledger. It was about Samuel and his desperate, dangerous attempts at rescue. It was about Jedediah, a man forced to be a monster to protect the one he loved. It was a web of pain and fear, all spun by one man. As darkness fell, cloaking the canyon in an inky blackness, they prepared to move. Samuel gave Clara the last of the water from his canteen. The horse, rested but still weary, stood patiently. Suddenly the horse's ears twitched. It let out a low, nervous whinny. Samuel put a hand on its muzzle, his body going rigid. "Someone's coming," he whispered. They both froze, listening. From the mouth of the canyon, they heard the distinct sound of a single horse, walking slowly, its hooves crunching on the loose rock. It wasn't the sound of a posse. It was the sound of one rider, approaching cautiously. A friend? Or a scout for the enemy? Samuel drew the pistol he had tucked into his belt, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. He pushed Clara behind the boulder, shielding her with his body. The rider came closer. They could see his silhouette now against the star-dusted sky. He stopped just yards from their hiding place. "Samuel?" a voice called out, a strained, urgent whisper. "Samuel, are you in here?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. It was Jedediah. Samuel hesitated for a long moment, then slowly lowered his pistol. He stepped out from behind the rock. "I'm here." Jedediah slumped in his saddle, his relief so palpable it was almost a physical thing. "Thank God," he breathed. "I thought they'd caught you." He looked past Samuel and saw Clara. His face, even in the dim light, was a canvas of shame and regret. "Miss Clara," he stammered. I'm so sorry. For what I did. For what I said." "Samuel told me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "He told me everything. You were trying to protect me." A dry, harsh sob escaped Jedediah's lips. "It was the only way. I saw them waiting for you. Blackstone's men. I had to make them leave you alone." He slid from his horse, his movements clumsy with exhaustion. "But it didn't work. Blackstone knows. He knows you took her in, Samuel. He's torn the town apart looking for you. He's offering a reward. Every bounty hunter and lowlife in the territory will be after you by morning." "We're heading east," Samuel said. "We'll be gone by then." "You won't make it," Jedediah said, shaking his head. "They're watching the passes. They're watching the roads. There's no way out." A heavy, hopeless silence fell between them. They were trapped, boxed in by a man with unlimited resources and no conscience. "But," Jedediah said, his voice dropping, a new, desperate energy entering his tone, "there might be one way. A way to end this. For good." He looked from Samuel to Clara, his eyes wild with a reckless, dangerous idea. "Blackstone keeps something in his office. A safe. Inside that safe are ledgers, just like yours, Samuel, but worse. They detail everything. The names of the women, the money he's made, the bribes he's paid to territorial officials. It's the proof of every crime he's ever committed." "You want us to break into the judge's office?" Samuel asked, incredulous. "I can get you in," Jedediah insisted. "He's holding a party tonight at his mansion, celebrating his victory over you. The courthouse will be empty, except for a couple of guards I can distract. If we can get those ledgers to the U.S. Marshals in Helena, Blackstone is finished. We're all free." It was insane. It was a suicide mission. But as Clara looked at the two men standing before her, the man who had cruelly saved her and the man who had kindly sheltered her, she realized it was also their only hope. Running would never be enough. Blackstone would hunt them to the ends of the earth. The only way to survive was to turn and fight. The only way to win was to expose the monster to the light. "I'm in," she heard herself say, the words feeling both terrifying and strangely empowering. Both men turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and admiration. "Clara, no," Samuel said. "It's too dangerous." "What's more dangerous than waiting for his men to find us here?" she countered, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "You've spent years saving these women one by one. This is a chance to save them all. To get justice for the ones you couldn't, like Sarah. We have to try." Jedediah looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a coward or a bully, but a man desperate for a chance at redemption. "She's right," he said, his voice firm. "We do this together, or we all die alone." The three of them, a strange and unlikely alliance bound by a shared enemy, stood together in the darkness of the canyon. They were no longer running. They were heading back into the heart of the beast's lair. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that not all of them might make it out alive. The town was eerily quiet as they slipped back in under the cover of darkness. The sounds of raucous music and laughter drifted from the large, brightly lit mansion on the hill, Judge Blackstone's party. Just as Jedediah had said, the rest of the town was a ghost town. They tethered their horses in a dark alley behind the courthouse, a stark, imposing building that represented not justice, but fear. "All right," Jedediah whispered, his face pale in the moonlight. "There are two guards. One watches the front, one patrols the back. I'll create a diversion on the far side of the building. A fire. It should draw them both. That will give you 5 minutes, maybe 10 at most, to get in, get the safe open, and get out." "How do we open the safe?" Samuel asked. Jedediah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy stick of dynamite. "With this," he said grimly. "The fuse is short. You'll have to light it and run." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was real, terribly real. "I'll go with you," she said to Samuel. "No," he said firmly. You stay here with the horses. If we're not back in 10 minutes, you ride. You ride east and you don't look back. You get away, Clara. That's all that matters." He looked deep into her eyes, his expression so full of raw, unspoken emotion that it made her ache. Before she could argue, Jedediah was gone, melting into the shadows. A few minutes later, a bright orange glow lit up the sky on the other side of the courthouse, followed by the sound of shouting. The diversion. "That's my cue," Samuel said. He squeezed her hand, a quick, firm gesture of reassurance. 10 minutes, and then he too disappeared into the darkness. Clara was left alone in the alley, her senses on high alert. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every creak, every gust of wind, every distant shout from the judge's party sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She counted the seconds in her head, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the back door of the courthouse. 5 minutes passed, then 7, then 9. "He's not coming back," the panicked voice in her head screamed. Something went wrong. She was about to mount her horse, to follow his last order and flee, when she heard it. A muffled, tremendous boom that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. The explosion. Seconds later, Samuel burst out of the back door, a heavy leather satchel clutched in his hand. He was coughing, his face smudged with soot. "Go!" he yelled, sprinting toward the horses. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 guards, drawn by the explosion, appeared in the doorway, their guns raised. At the same time, from the other end of the alley, another figure emerged from the shadows. It was Judge Blackstone himself, his party clothes disheveled, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He must have seen the fire and come to investigate. And with him were 3 of his most ruthless enforcers. They were trapped, pinned between 2 groups of armed men. "Well, well," Blackstone sneered, his voice smooth and cold as ice. "The brave rancher and his hefty companion. Did you really think you could steal from me?" Samuel pushed Clara behind him, raising his own pistol. "It's over, Blackstone," he said, his voice steady despite the impossible odds. "We have your ledgers." Blackstone laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "Those ledgers will burn with your bodies," he said, raising his own ornate pistol. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tense standoff. "No, they won't." Everyone turned. Standing at the entrance to the alley, his face streaked with soot but his eyes clear and determined, was Jedediah. And he wasn't alone. Behind him stood nearly 24 men, ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers. The ordinary men of the town, their faces grim, their hands holding rifles and shotguns. "What is the meaning of this?" Blackstone roared, his composure finally cracking. "These are my men. This is my town." "Not anymore," Jedediah said, his voice ringing with newfound courage. "We're tired of living in fear. We're tired of watching you destroy our homes and our families. Tonight, it ends." For a heart-stopping moment, no one moved. It was a standoff, the future of the entire territory hanging in the balance in a dusty back alley. Then, one of Blackstone's men made a fatal mistake. He flinched, his gun hand twitching. It was all the opening Jedediah's makeshift army needed. The alley exploded in a deafening volley of gunfire. Clara screamed and dropped to the ground, Samuel shielding her with his body. The air filled with acrid smoke and the screams of men. When the initial barrage was over, Blackstone's enforcers and the courthouse guards were all down, but the judge himself was still standing, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He leveled his pistol, not at Samuel, not at Jedediah, but at Clara. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking you with me." He fired. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Clara saw the flash from the barrel, the puff of smoke. She saw Samuel lunge toward her. But she also saw another figure move even faster. Jedediah threw himself in front of her, taking the full force of the bullet in his chest. He gasped, a look of pained surprise on his face, before crumpling to the ground. Before Blackstone could fire again, Samuel's gun barked once. The judge staggered back, a dark stain spreading across his pristine white shirt, and fell to the dirt, his reign of terror finally over. Clara rushed to Jedediah's side, Samuel right behind her. She knelt, cradling his head in her lap. His breathing was shallow, his eyes already beginning to glaze over. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his gaze finding hers. "For everything." "You saved me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Twice." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "My sister," he began. "We'll find her," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll make sure she's safe. I promise." Jedediah's eyes closed, and with one last, shuddering breath, he was gone. The trials were a sensation that rocked the entire Montana territory. The Ledgers, Clara and Samuel, had risked their lives for laid bare a web of corruption and evil that reached the highest levels of government. Blackstone's empire crumbled to dust. With the town finally free from his shadow, Jedediah's sister was found and cared for. The saloons and mines that had been built on the suffering of so many were shut down. And the names of the women in the ledgers were finally spoken aloud, their stories told, their memory honored. Clara, once a silent victim, found her voice. She wrote an account of everything that had happened, a powerful raw story that was published in newspapers all across the country. Her words, once dismissed, now brought down a tyrant and gave hope to countless others. Samuel, the quiet rancher who had sought only to do good in the shadows, was hailed as a hero. He rebuilt his ranch, not as a lonely refuge, but as a home. One quiet evening, as the sky turned a familiar crimson and the air filled with the scent of pine, he stood with Clara on the porch where they had spent so many nights. "I never thought," Clara said softly, "that the worst day of my life would lead me to the best part of it." Samuel took her hand, his touch as steady and strong as it had been on that first day at the station. "That man at the station," he said, "he saw you with his eyes, but I saw you with my heart." His voice was low and tender as he finally spoke the words she had once thought she would never hear. "I love you, Clara, not for how you look, but for who you are, for your strength, for your fire, for your beautiful, unbreakable spirit." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The rejection that had once shattered her had only cleared the path to a love more real and profound than any she had ever dared to dream of. A love that had been forged in fear and fire, and had emerged stronger than steel. She leaned into his embrace, finally home. The journey had been a nightmare, but it had led her here. It had led her to him. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that their story, a story of unexpected heroes, cruel kindness, and a love that saw beyond the surface, was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the strange, dark, and mysterious.